There once lived, in a sequestered part of the county of Devonshire, one Mr. Godfrey Nickleby, a worthy gentleman who, taking it into his head rather late in life that he must get married, and not being young enough or rich enough to aspire to the hand of a lady of fortune, had wedded an old flame out of mere attachment, who, in her turn, had taken him for the same reason. At length, after 5 years, when Mrs. Nickleby had presented her husband with a couple of sons, and that embarrassed gentleman, impressed with the necessity of making some provision for his family, was seriously revolving in his mind a little commercial speculation of insuring his life next quarter day, and then falling from the top of the monument by accident, there came one morning, by the general post, a black-bordered letter, to inform him how his uncle, Mr. Ralph Nickleby, was dead, and had left him the bulk of his little property, amounting in all to £5,000 sterling. With a portion of this property, Mr. Godfrey Nickleby purchased a small farm near Dawlish, in Devonshire, whither he retired with his wife and 2 children, to live upon the best interest he could get for the rest of his money, and the little produce he could raise from his land. The two prospered so well together that, when he died some 15 years after this period, and some 5 after his wife, he was enabled to leave his eldest son, Ralph, £3,000 in cash, and to his youngest son, Nicholas, 1,000 and the farm. On the death of his father, Ralph Nickleby, who had been some time before placed in a mercantile house in London, applied himself passionately to his old pursuit of money-getting, in which he speedily became so buried and absorbed that he quite forgot his brother for many years. And if at times a recollection of his old playfellow broke upon him through the haze in which he lived, for gold conjures up a mist about a man more destructive of all his old senses and lulling to his feelings than the fumes of charcoal, it brought along with it a companion thought, that if they were intimate, he would want to borrow money of him, and Mr. Ralph Nickleby shrugged his shoulders and said things were better as they were. As for Nicholas, he lived a single man on the patrimonial estate until he grew tired of living alone, and then took to wife the daughter of a neighbouring gentleman with a dower of £1,000. This good lady bore him 2 children, a son, Nicholas, and a daughter, Kate. And when the son was about 19 and the daughter 14, Mr. Nickleby looked about him for the means of repairing his capital, now sadly reduced by this increase in his family and the expenses of their education. "Speculate with it," said Mrs. Nickleby. Mr. Nickleby speculated, and was ruined. His reason went astray, and he died. Mr. Ralph Nickleby was not, strictly speaking, what you would call a merchant. Neither was he a banker, nor an attorney, nor a special pleader, nor a notary. He was certainly not a tradesman, and still less could he lay any claim to the title of a professional gentleman, for it would have been impossible to mention any recognized profession to which he belonged. Nevertheless, as he lived in a spacious house in Golden Square, which, in addition to a brass plate upon the street door, had another brass plate, 2 sizes and a half smaller, upon the left-hand doorpost, surmounting a brass model of an infant's fist grasping a fragment of a skewer and displaying the word "Office," it was clear that Mr. Ralph Nickleby did, or pretended to do, business of some kind. Mr. Ralph Nickleby sat in his private office one morning, ready dressed to walk abroad. At length his eyes wandered to a little dirty window on the left, through which the face of the clerk was dimly visible, and that worthy, chancing to look up, he beckoned him to attend. In obedience to this summons, the clerk got off the high stool, to which he had communicated a high polish by countless gettings off and on, and presented himself in Mr. Nickleby's room. He was a tall man, of middle age, with 2 goggle eyes, whereof one was a fixture, a rubicund nose, a cadaverous face, and a suit of clothes, if the term be allowable when they suited him not at all, much the worse for wear, very much too small, and placed upon such a short allowance of buttons that it was quite marvellous how he contrived to keep them on. "Was that 12:30, Noggs?" said Mr. Nickleby in a sharp and grating voice. "Not more than 5:20 by the... Noggs was going to add public-house clock, but recollecting himself, he substituted regular time. "My watch has stopped," said Mr. Nickleby. "I don't know from what cause." "Not wound up," said Noggs. "Yes, it is," said Mr. Nickleby. "Over-wound, then," rejoined Noggs. "That can't very well be," observed Mr. Nickleby. "Must be," said Noggs. "Well," said Mr. Nickleby, putting the repeater back into his pocket, "perhaps it is." Noggs gave a peculiar grunt, as was his custom at the end of all disputes with his master, to imply that he, Noggs, triumphed, and, as he rarely spoke to anybody unless somebody spoke to him, fell into a grim silence, and rubbed his hands slowly over each other, cracking the joints of his fingers, and squeezing them into all possible distortions. "Ah, Newman," said Mr. Nickleby, looking up at him. "The letter about the mortgage has come, has it? I thought it would." "Wrong," replied Newman. "What? And nobody called respecting it?" inquired Mr. Nickleby, pausing. Noggs shook his head. "What has come, then?" inquired Mr. Nickleby. "I have," said Newman. "What else?" demanded the master sternly. "This," said Newman, drawing a sealed letter slowly from his pocket. "Postmark Strand. Black wax. Black border. Woman's hand. C.N. in the corner." "Black wax," said Mr. Nickleby, glancing at the letter. "I know something of that hand, too. Newman, I shouldn't be surprised if my brother were dead." "I don't think you would," said Newman, quietly. "Why not, sir?" demanded Mr. Nickleby. "You never are surprised," replied Newman. "That's all." Mr. Nickleby snatched the letter from his assistant, and fixing a cold look upon him, opened, read it, put it in his pocket, and having now hit the time to a second, began winding up his watch. "It is as I expected, Newman," said Mr. Nickleby, while he was thus engaged. "He is dead. Dear me. Well, there's a sudden thing. I shouldn't have thought it, really." "Children alive?" inquired Noggs. "Why, that's the very thing," replied Mr. Nickleby, as though his thoughts were about them at that moment. "They are, both alive." "Both?" repeated Newman Noggs, in a low voice. "And the widow, too," added Mr. Nickleby. "And all three in London. Confound them. All three here, Newman." Full of these and many other reflections of a similar kind, Mr. Nickleby made the best of his way to the Strand, and referring to his letter, as if to ascertain the number of the house he wanted, stopped at a private door about halfway down that crowded thoroughfare. A miniature painter lived there, Miss La Creevy. A few words from Mr. Ralph Nickleby were sufficient to persuade that lady, despite her good nature, that letting her second-floor rooms to Mrs. Nickleby and her 2 children had not been the wisest course to follow. "Certainly," said Miss La Creevy, rubbing her hands. "If Mrs. Nickleby took the apartments without the means of paying for them, it was very unbecoming a lady." "Of course it was, ma'am," said Ralph, and so saying, he made his way upstairs. A lady in deep mourning rose as Mr. Ralph Nickleby entered, but appeared incapable of advancing to meet him, and leant upon the arm of a slight but very beautiful girl of about 17, who had been sitting by her. A youth, who appeared a year or 2 older, stepped forward and saluted Ralph as his uncle. "Oh," growled Ralph, with an ill-favoured frown. "You are Nicholas, I suppose?" "That is my name, sir," replied the youth. "Well, ma'am," said Ralph, impatiently, "the creditors have administered, you tell me, and there's nothing left for you." "I hoped," faltered Mrs. Nickleby, "that you might have an opportunity of doing something for your brother's children. It was his dying wish that I should appeal to you in their behalf." With an ill grace, Ralph Nickleby addressed himself to this question. He drew a newspaper from his pocket and began to read from one of the advertisements. Here, perhaps, was the answer for Nicholas. Education. At Mr. Wackford Squeers's Academy. Dotheboys Hall. At the delightful village of Dotheboys near Greta Bridge in Yorkshire. Youth are boarded. Terms 20 guineas per annum. No extras. No vacations, and diet unparalleled. Mr. Squeers is in town, and attends daily from 1 till 4 at the Saracen's Head, Snow Hill. An able assistant wanted. Annual salary £5. A Master of Arts would be preferred. There, said Ralph, folding the paper again. Let him get that situation, and his fortune is made. But he is not a Master of Arts, said Mrs. Nickleby. That, replied Ralph. That, I think, can be got over. So uncle and nephew issued forth together in quest of that accomplished gentleman, Mr. Squeers, who was to be found in the Saracen's Head at Snow Hill. Mr. Squeers's appearance was not prepossessing. He had but one eye, and the popular prejudice runs in favour of two. The eye he had was unquestionably useful, but decidedly not ornamental, being of greenish-grey, and in shape resembling the fanlight of a street door. The blank side of his face was much wrinkled and puckered up, which gave him a very sinister appearance, especially when he smiled, at which time his expression bordered closely on the villainous. In a corner was a very small deal trunk, tied round with a scanty piece of cord, and on the trunk was perched, his lace-up half-boots and corduroy trousers dangling in the air, a diminutive boy, with his shoulders drawn up to his ears, and his hands planted on his knees, who glanced timidly at the schoolmaster from time to time with evident dread and apprehension. 3:30, muttered Mr. Squeers, turning from the window and looking sulkily at the coffee-room clock. There will be nobody here today. Much vexed by this reflection, Mr. Squeers looked at the little boy to see whether he was doing anything he could beat him for. As he happened not to be doing anything at all, he merely boxed his ears and told him not to do it again. At midsummer, muttered Mr. Squeers, resuming his complaint, I took down 10 boys, 10 20s, £200. I go back at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, and I've got only 3 oughts and ought, 3 2s are 6, £60. What's come of all the boys? What's parents got into their heads? What does it all mean? Here the little boy on top of the trunk gave a violent sneeze. Mr. Squeers knocked him off the trunk with a blow on one side of his face, and knocked him on again with a blow on the other. Wait till I get you down into Yorkshire, my young gentleman, said Mr. Squeers, and then I'll give you the rest. Mr. Squeers, said the waiter, looking in at this juncture, here's a gentleman asking for you at the bar. Show the gentleman in, Richard, replied Mr. Squeers, in a soft voice. Put your handkerchief into your pocket, you little scoundrel, or I'll murder you when the gentleman goes. The schoolmaster had scarcely uttered these words in a fierce whisper when the stranger entered. Mr. Squeers, I believe, sir. The same, sir, said Mr. Squeers, with an assumption of extreme surprise. The gentleman, said the stranger, that advertised in the Times newspaper, Morning Post, Chronicle, Herald, and Advertiser, regarding the academy called Dotheboys Hall, at the delightful village of Dotheboys, near Greta Bridge in Yorkshire, added Mr. Squeers. You come on business, sir, I see by my young friends. How do you do, my little gentleman? And how do you do, sir? With this salutation, Mr. Squeers patted the heads of 2 hollow-eyed, small-boned little boys, whom the applicant had brought with him, and waited for further communications. I'm in the oil and colour way. My name is Snawley, sir, said the stranger. I've been thinking, Mr. Squeers, of placing my 2 boys at your school. It is not for me to say so, sir, replied Mr. Squeers, but I don't think you could possibly do a better thing. Said the other, £20 per annum, I believe, Mr. Squeers. Guineas, rejoined the schoolmaster with a persuasive smile. Pounds for 2, I think, Mr. Squeers, said Mr. Snawley, solemnly. I don't think it could be done, sir, replied Squeers, as if he had never considered the proposition before. Let me see, 4 5 is 20, double that and deduct the... Well, £1 either way shall not stand betwixt us. You must recommend me to your connection, sir, and make it up that way. They are not great eaters, said Mr. Snawley. "Oh, that doesn't matter at all," replied Squeers. "We don't consider the boys' appetites at our establishment." This was strictly true. They did not. "Every wholesome luxury, sir, that Yorkshire can afford," continued Squeers. "Every beautiful moral that Mrs. Squeers can instil. In short, every comfort of a home that a boy could wish for will be theirs, Mr. Snawley." Having entered Mr. Snawley's address, the schoolmaster had next to perform the still more agreeable office of entering the receipt of the first quarter's payment in advance, which he had scarcely completed when another voice was heard inquiring for Mr. Squeers. "Here he is," replied the schoolmaster. "What is it?" "Only a matter of business, sir," said Ralph Nickleby, presenting himself, closely followed by Nicholas. "Perhaps you recollect me," said Ralph, looking narrowly at the schoolmaster.
You paid me a small account at each of my half-yearly visits to town for some years, I think, sir," replied Squeers.
"I did," rejoined Ralph.
"For the parents of a boy named Dawker, who unfortunately
died at Dotheboys Hall," said Ralph, finishing the sentence. "You have advertised for an able assistant, sir?" he continued.
Precisely so," said Squeers.
"And you really want one?"
"Yes, certainly," answered Squeers.
"Here he is," said Ralph. "My nephew, Nicholas, hot from school, with everything he learnt there fermenting in his head and nothing fermenting in his pocket. He's just the man you want."
"I am afraid,"
said Squeers, perplexed with such an application from a youth of Nicholas's figure.
"I am afraid the young man won't suit me."
"Yes, he will," said Ralph. "I know better. Let me have 2 words with you." The 2 words were had apart, and in a couple of minutes Mr. Wackford Squeers announced that Mr. Nicholas Nickleby was from that moment thoroughly nominated to, and installed in, the office of First Assistant Master at Dotheboys Hall.
"At 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, Mr. Nickleby," said Squeers. "The coach starts. You must be here at 1:15, as we take these boys with us."
"Certainly, sir," said Nicholas. "And your fare down I have paid," growled Ralph. "So you'll have nothing to do but to keep yourself warm." Here was another instance of his uncle's generosity. Nicholas felt his unexpected kindness so much that he could scarcely find words to thank him. "You'd better go home now and pack up what you've got to pack," said his uncle. "But first find your way to Golden Square and leave these papers with my clerk." Nicholas did as he was bidden, and there he met Mr. Noggs returning from the public house. "Come in," said Newman. Without another word he led Nicholas into the passage, and thence into the official pantry at the end of it, where he thrust him into a chair, and mounting upon his high stool, sat with his arms hanging straight down by his sides, gazing fixedly upon him, as from a tower of observation. "There is no answer," said Nicholas, laying the parcel on a table beside him. Newman said nothing, but folding his arms, and thrusting his head forward so as to obtain a nearer view of Nicholas's face, scanned his features closely. "No answer," said Nicholas, speaking very loud, under the impression that Newman Noggs was deaf. It was a great exertion for Newman Noggs, but he then demanded of Nicholas what his uncle was going to do for him. Nicholas entered into a glowing description of all the honours and advantages to be derived from his appointment at that seat of learning, Dotheboys Hall. But what's the matter? Are you ill?" said Nicholas, suddenly breaking off, as his companion, after throwing himself into a variety of uncouth attitudes, thrust his hands under the stool and cracked his finger-joints as if he were snapping all the bones in his hands. Newman Noggs made no reply, but went on, shrugging his shoulders and cracking his finger-joints, smiling horribly all the time, and looking steadfastly at nothing out of the tops of his eyes in a most ghastly manner. Next morning, Nicholas commenced his expedition to Yorkshire. The little preparations for his journey were made mournfully indeed, and the leave-taking from his mother and Kate was the occasion for many tears. Nicholas implored Miss La Creevy to show some kindness to Kate. "Depend upon that," said the good-natured miniature painter, "and God bless you, Mr. Nickleby, and I wish you well." It was very little that Nicholas knew of the world, but he guessed enough about its ways to think that if he gave Miss La Creevy one little kiss, perhaps she might not be the less kindly disposed towards those he was leaving behind. So he gave her 3 or 4 with a kind of jocose gallantry, and Miss La Creevy evinced no greater symptoms of displeasure than declaring, as she adjusted her yellow turban, that she'd never heard of such a thing and couldn't have believed it possible. Nicholas made his way very speedily to the Saracen's Head, Snow Hill, where he found Mr. Squeers sitting at breakfast over coffee, toast, and cold beef, watched hungrily by the 5 little boys in his charge, for whom Mr. Squeers had just ordered a jug of milk, diluted with lukewarm water. "Sit down, Mr. Nickleby," said Squeers. "Here we are, a-breakfasting, you see." Nicholas did not see that anyone was breakfasting except Mr. Squeers, but he bowed with all becoming reverence, and looked as cheerful as he could. "Oh, that's the milk and water, is it, William?" said Squeers. "Very good. Don't forget the bread and butter presently." At this mention of bread and butter, the 5 little boys looked very eager, and followed the waiter out with their eyes. Meanwhile, Mr. Squeers tasted the milk and water. "Ah," said that gentleman, smacking his lips, "here's richness. Think of the many beggars and orphans in this street that would be glad of this, little boys. A shocking thing, hunger is. Isn't it, Mr. Nickleby?" "Very shocking, sir," said Nicholas. "When I say number 1, pursued Mr. Squeers, putting the mug before the children, the boy on the left hand nearest the window may take a drink. And when I say number 2, the boy next to him will go in, and so on till we come to number 5, which is the last boy. Are you ready?" "Yes, sir," cried all the little boys with great eagerness. "That's right," said Squeers, calmly getting on with his breakfast. "Keep ready till I tell you to begin. Subdue your appetites, my dears, and you've conquered human nature." "This is the way we inculcate strength of mind, Mr. Nickleby," said the schoolmaster, turning to Nicholas, and speaking with his mouth very full of beef and toast. Nicholas murmured something, he knew not what, in reply, and the little boys, dividing their gaze between the mug, the bread and butter, which had by this time arrived, and every morsel which Mr. Squeers took into his mouth, remained with strained eyes in torments of expectation. "Thank God for a good breakfast," said Squeers when he had finished. "Number 1 may take a drink." Number 1 seized the mug ravenously, and had just drunk enough to make him wish for more when Mr. Squeers gave the signal for number 2, who gave up at the same interesting moment to number 3, and the process was repeated till the milk and water terminated with number 5. "And now," said the schoolmaster, dividing the bread and butter for 3 into as many portions as there were children, "you had better look sharp with your breakfast, for the horn will blow in a minute or 2, and then every boy leaves off." Too soon for the unfortunate boys, the horn sounded, and there was all the heat and bustle of concluding the operations for departure, interrupted briefly by the arrival of Ralph Nickleby, Mrs. Nickleby, and Kate. Having made his farewells, Nicholas, aboard the stage, felt somebody pulling softly at his leg. He looked down, and there stood Newman Noggs, who pushed up into his hand a dirty letter. "What's this?" inquired Nicholas. "Hush!" rejoined Noggs, pointing to Mr. Ralph Nickleby, who was saying a few earnest words to Squeers a short distance off. "Take it. Read it. Nobody knows. That's all." "Sit fast here, gentlemen," said the guard as he clambered up. "Off she goes." And off she did go, if coaches be feminine, amidst a loud flourish from the guard's horn. The weather was intensely and bitterly cold. A great deal of snow fell from time to time, and the wind was intolerably keen. Mr. Squeers got down at almost every stage, to stretch his legs, as he said, and as he always came back from such excursions with a very red nose, and composed himself to sleep directly, there is reason to suppose that he had derived great benefit from the process. The journey dragged on uncomfortably enough, until at last Nicholas and Mr. Squeers, and the little boys, and their united luggage, were all put down together at the George and New Inn, Greta Bridge, there to transfer to a rusty pony chaise and a cart. "Is it much further to Dotheboys Hall, sir?" asked Nicholas. "About 3 miles from here," replied Squeers. "But you needn't call it a hall down here." Nicholas coughed, as if he would like to know why. "Well, the fact is, it ain't a hall," observed Squeers dryly. "Oh, indeed," said Nicholas, whom this piece of intelligence much astonished.
No, replied Squeers. We call it a haul-up in London because it sounds better, but they don't know it by that name in these parts. A man may call his house an island if he likes. There's no Act of Parliament against that, I believe.
I believe not, sir, rejoined Nicholas. Upon their arrival, Nicholas had time to observe that the school was a long, cold-looking house, 1 story high, with a few straggling outbuildings behind, and a barn and stable adjoining. After the lapse of a minute or two, the noise of somebody unlocking the yard gate was heard, and presently a tall, lean boy, with a lantern in his hand, issued forth.
"Is that you, Smike?"
cried Squeers.
"Yes, sir,"
replied the boy.
"Then why the devil didn't you come before?"
"Please, sir, I fell asleep over the fire," answered Smike, with humility.
"Fire? What fire? Where's there a fire?" demanded the schoolmaster sharply.
"Only in the kitchen, sir," replied the boy. "Missus said as I was sitting up, I might go in there for a warm."
"Your missus is a fool," retorted Squeers. "You'd have been a deuced deal more wakeful in the cold, I'll engage."
Nicholas was ushered into a small parlour, scantily furnished. A couple of minutes later, a female, of a large, raw-boned figure, with a dirty nightcap on, bounced into the room, and seizing Mr. Squeers by the throat, gave him 2 loud kisses, one close after the other, like a postman's knock.
"How is my Squeery?"
said this lady, in a playful manner, and a very hoarse voice.
"Quite well, my love,"
replied Squeers.
"This is the new young man, my dear."
"Oh," replied Mrs. Squeers, nodding her head at Nicholas, and eyeing him coldly from top to toe.
"He'll take a meal with us tonight," said Squeers, "and go down amongst the boys tomorrow morning. You can give him a shake down here tonight, can't you?" "Well, we must manage it somehow," replied the lady. "You don't mind much how you sleep, I suppose, sir?"
"No, indeed," replied Nicholas. "I am not particular."
"That's lucky,"
said Mrs. Squeers, and as the lady's humour was considered to lie chiefly in retort, Mr. Squeers laughed heartily, and seemed to expect that Nicholas should do the same. After some further conversation between the master and mistress relative to the success of Mr. Squeers's trip, and the people who had paid, and the people who had made default in payment, a young servant girl brought in a Yorkshire pie and some cold beef, which being set upon the table, the boy Smike appeared with a jug of ale. Mr. Squeers was emptying his greatcoat pockets of letters to different boys, and other small documents which he had brought down in them. The boy glanced with an anxious and timid expression at the papers, as if with a sickly hope that one among them might relate to him. The look was a very painful one, and went to Nicholas's heart at once, for it told a long and very sad history. It induced him to consider the boy more attentively, and he was surprised to observe the extraordinary mixture of garments which formed his dress. Although he could not have been less than 18 or 19 years old, and was tall for that age, he wore a skeleton suit, such as is usually put on very little boys, and which, though most absurdly short in the arms and legs, was quite wide enough for his attenuated frame. He was lame, and, as he feigned to be busy in arranging the table, glanced at the letters with a look so keen and yet so dispirited and hopeless that Nicholas could hardly bear to watch him.
"What are you bothering about there, Smike?" cried Mrs. Squeers. "Let those things alone, can't you?"
"Eh?" said Squeers, looking up.
"Oh, it's you, is it?"
"Yes, sir," replied the youth, pressing his hands together, as though to control by force the nervous wandering of his fingers. "Is there—"
"Well?"
said Squeers.
"Have you... Did anybody... Has nothing been heard about me?"
"Devil a bit," replied Squeers testily. The lad withdrew his eyes, and putting his hand to his face, moved towards the door.
"Not a word,"
resumed Squeers.
"And never will be. Now, this is a pretty sort of thing, isn't it? That you should have been left here all these years and no money paid after the first 6, nor no notice taken, nor no clue to be got to who you belong to. It's a pretty sort of thing that I shall have to feed a great fellow like you, isn't it? And never hope to get 1 penny for it. Eh? But come, let's have supper, for I'm hungry and tired and want to get to bed.
This reminder brought in an exclusive steak for Mr. Squeers, who speedily proceeded to do it ample justice. Nicholas drew his chair up, but his appetite was effectually taken away.
"How's the steak, Squeers?"
said Mrs. S. "Tender as a lamb," replied Squeers. "Have a bit."
"I couldn't eat a morsel," replied his wife. "What'll the young man take, my dear?"
"Whatever he likes that's present," rejoined Squeers, in a most unusual burst of generosity.
"What do you say, Mr. Knuckleboy?"
inquired Mrs. Squeers. "I'll take a little of the pie, if you please," replied Nicholas. "A very little, for I'm not hungry."
"Well, it's a pity to cut the pie if you're not hungry, isn't it?" said Mrs. Squeers. "Will you try a piece of the beef?"
"Whatever you please," replied Nicholas abstractedly. "It's all the same to me." The 5 boys were regaled with a light supper of porridge, and stowed away side by side in a small bedstead to warm each other and dream of a substantial meal, while Mr. Squeers treated himself to a stiff tumbler of brandy and water, yawned fearfully, and opined that it was high time to go to bed, upon which signal Mrs. Squeers and the girl dragged in a small straw mattress and a couple of blankets, and arranged them into a couch for Nicholas.
"We'll put you in your regular bedroom tomorrow, Nickleby," said Squeers. "Let me see, who sleeps in Brooks's bed, my dear?" "In Brooks's," said Mrs. Squeers, pondering. "There's Jennings, Little Boulder, Greymarsh, and what's his name?"
"So there are," rejoined Squeers. "Yes, Brooks is full." "Full?" thought Nicholas. "I should think he was."
"There's a place somewhere, I know," said Squeers, "but I can't at this moment call to mind where it is. However, we'll have all that settled tomorrow. Good night, Nickleby. 7 o'clock in the morning, mind."
"I shall be ready, sir," replied Nicholas. "Good night." Mr. Squeers then nudged Mrs. Squeers to bring away the brandy bottle, lest Nicholas should help himself in the night, and the lady having seized it with great precipitation, they retired together. Nicholas, being left alone, grew less desponding, and, so sanguine and buoyant his youth, he even hoped that affairs at Dotheboys Hall might yet prove better than they promised. He was preparing for bed with something like renewed cheerfulness, when a sealed letter fell from his coat pocket. In the hurry of leaving London, it had escaped his attention, and had not occurred to him since. But it at once brought back to him the recollection of the mysterious behaviour of Newman Noggs. "Dear me," said Nicholas, "what an extraordinary hand!" It was directed to himself, was written upon very dirty paper, and in such cramped and crippled writing as to be almost illegible. After great difficulty and much puzzling, he contrived to read as follows: "My dear young man, I know the world. Your father did not, or he would not have done me a kindness when there was no hope of return. You do not, or you would not be bound on such a journey. If you ever want shelter in London, don't be angry at this. I once thought I never should. They know where I live, at the sign of the Crown, in Silver Street, Golden Square. It is at the corner of Silver Street and James Street, with a bar door both ways. You can come at night. Once nobody was ashamed. Never mind that. It's all over. Excuse errors. I should forget how to wear a whole coat now. I've forgotten all my old ways. My spelling may have gone with them. Yours obediently, Newman Noggs. P.S. If you should ever go near Barnard Castle, there is good ale at the King's Head. Say you know me, and I am sure they will not charge you for it. You may say, Mr. Noggs there. For I was a gentleman then. I was indeed." It may be a very undignified circumstance to record, but after he had folded this letter and placed it in his pocket-book, Nicholas Nickleby's eyes were dimmed with a moisture that might have been taken for tears. Morning came, and with it the time for Nicholas to be introduced to the young nobleman of Dotheboys Hall, and Mr. Squeers's educational system. "There," said the schoolmaster as they stepped in together. "This is our shop, Nickleby." It was such a crowded scene, and there were so many objects to attract attention, that at first Nicholas stared about him, really without seeing anything at all. By degrees, however, the place resolved itself into a bare and dirty room, with a couple of windows, whereof a 10th part might be of glass, the remainder being stopped up with old copybooks and paper. There were a couple of long old rickety desks, cut and notched, and inked and damaged in every possible way. 2 or 3 forms, a detached desk for Squeers, and another for his assistant. The ceiling was supported like that of a barn, by crossbeams and rafters, and the walls were so stained and discoloured that it was impossible to tell whether they had ever been touched with paint or whitewash. But the pupils, the young nobleman, how the last faint traces of hope, the remotest glimmering of any good to be derived from his efforts in this den, faded from the mind of Nicholas as he looked in dismay around. Pale and haggard faces, lank and bony figures, children with the countenances of old men, deformities with irons upon their limbs, boys of stunted growth, and others whose long, meagre legs would hardly bear their stooping bodies, all crowded on the view together. There were the bleared eye, the hare lip, the crooked foot, and every ugliness or distortion that told of unnatural aversion conceived by parents for their offspring, or of young lives which, from the earliest dawn of infancy, had been one horrible endurance of cruelty and neglect. There were little faces which should have been handsome, darkened with the scowl of sullen, dogged suffering. There was childhood, with the light of its eye quenched, its beauty gone. Mrs. Squeers stood at one of the desks, presiding over an immense basin of brimstone and treacle, of which delicious compound she administered a large instalment to each boy in succession, using for the purpose a common wooden spoon, which might have been originally manufactured for some gigantic top, and which widened every young gentleman's mouth considerably, they all being obliged, under heavy corporal penalties, to take in the whole bowl at a gasp. "Now," said Squeers, giving the desk a great rap with his cane, which made half the little boys nearly jump out of their boots, "is that physicking over?" "Just over," said Mrs. Squeers, choking the last boy in her hurry, and tapping the crown of his head with a wooden spoon to restore him. "Here you are, Smike, take that away now, look sharp." Nicholas could not but observe how silent and sad the boys all seemed to be. There was none of the noise and clamour of a schoolroom, none of its boisterous play or hearty mirth. The children sat crouching and shivering together, and seemed to lack the spirit to move about. The only pupil who evinced the slightest tendency towards locomotion or playfulness was Master Squeers, and as his chief amusement was to tread upon the other boys' toes in his new boots, his flow of spirits was rather disagreeable than otherwise. "This is the first class in English spelling and philosophy, Nickleby," said Squeers, beckoning Nicholas to stand beside him. "We'll get up a Latin one and hand that over to you. Now then, where's the first boy?" "Please, sir, he's cleaning the back parlour window," said the temporary head of the philosophical class. "So he is, to be sure," rejoined Squeers. "We go upon the practical mode of teaching, Nickleby, the regular education system. C-L-E-A-N, clean, verb active, to make bright, to scour. W-I-N, win, D-E-R, der, winder, a casement. When the boy knows this out of a book, he goes and does it. It's just the same principle as the use of the globes. Where's the second boy?" "Please, sir, he's weeding the garden," replied a small voice. "To be sure," said Squeers, by no means disconcerted. "So he is. B-O-T, bot, T-I-N, tin, bottin, N-E-Y, knee, botany, noun, substantive, a knowledge of plants. When he has learned that botany means a knowledge of plants, he goes and knows 'em. That's our system, Nickleby. What do you think of it?" It's a very useful one, at any rate, answered Nicholas significantly.
I believe you, rejoined Squeers, not remarking the emphasis of his usher. Third boy, what's a horse?
A beast, sir,
replied the boy. So it is, said Squeers. Ain't it, Nickleby?
I believe there is no doubt of that, sir, answered Nicholas.
Of course there isn't, said Squeers. A horse is a quadruped, and quadruped's Latin for beast, as everybody that's gone through the grammar knows. Or else, where's the use of having grammars at all?
Where, indeed, said Nicholas abstractedly.
And as you're perfect in that, resumed Squeers, turning to the boy, go and look after my horse, and rub him down well, or I'll rub you down. That's the way we do it, Nickleby, he said, after a long pause.
Then there was business to be dispatched. The reading of letters addressed to the boys who had fallen under the care of Mr. Squeers.
Oh, said Squeers, Cobby's grandmother is dead, and his Uncle John has took to drinking, which is all the news his sister sends, except 18 pence, which will just pay for that broken square of glass. Mrs. Squeers, my dear, will you take the money?
The worthy lady pocketed the 18 pence with a most business-like air, and Squeers passed on to the next boy as coolly as possible. Young Boulder's father was £2.10 short with his fees, and retribution was to follow.
Boulder,
said Squeers, tucking up his wristbands and moistening the palm of his hand to get a good grip of the cane.
You're an incorrigible young scoundrel, and as the last thrashing did you no good, we must see what another will do towards beating it out of you.
With this, and wholly disregarding a piteous cry for mercy, Mr. Squeers fell upon the boy and caned him soundly, not leaving off indeed until his arm was tired out. At last, alone, Nicholas sat down, so depressed and self-degraded by the consciousness of his position, that if death could have come upon him at that time, he would have almost been happy to meet it. The cruelty of which he had been an unwilling witness, the coarse and ruffianly behaviour of Squeers, even in his best moods, the filthy place, the sights and sounds about him, all contributed to this state of feeling. As he was absorbed in these meditations, he all at once encountered the upturned face of Smike, who was on his knees before the stove, picking a few stray cinders from the hearth and planting them on the fire. He had paused to steal a look at Nicholas, and when he saw that he was observed, shrunk back, as if expecting a blow. "You need not fear me," said Nicholas kindly. "Are you cold?"
No.
"You are shivering."
"I am not cold,"
replied Smike quickly.
"I'm used to it."
There was such an obvious fear of giving offence in his manner, and he was such a timid, broken-spirited creature, that Nicholas could not help exclaiming, "Poor fellow!" If he had struck the drudge, he would have slunk away without a word, but now he burst into tears. "Oh dear, oh dear," he cried, covering his face with his cracked and horny hands. "My heart will break. It will. It will. There is always hope," said Nicholas. He knew not what to say. "No," rejoined the other. "No, none for me. Do you remember the boy that died here?" "I was not here, you know," said Nicholas gently. "But what of him?" "Why," replied the youth, drawing closer to his questioner's side, "I was with him at night, and when it was all silent, he cried no more for friends he wished to come and sit with him, but began to see faces round his bed that came from home. He said they smiled and talked to him, and died at last, lifting his head to kiss them. Do you hear?" "Yes, yes," rejoined Nicholas. "What faces will smile on me when I die?" said his companion, shivering. "Who will talk to me in those long nights?"
They cannot come from home. They would frighten me if they did, for I don't know what it is, and shouldn't know them. Pain and fear. Pain and fear for me, alive or dead. No hope. No hope.
The bell rang to bed, and the boy, subsiding at the sound into his usual listless state, crept away, as if anxious to avoid notice. It was with a heavy heart that Nicholas soon afterwards, no, not retired, there was no retirement there, followed to his dirty and crowded dormitory. Miss Fanny Squeers was in her 23rd year, short like her father, and with a voice of similarly harsh quality. She inherited from her mother a remarkable expression of the right eye, something akin to having none at all. A family discussion on the subject of Knuckleboy was followed by a tea-party and an introduction, Miss Squeers hastening to do the honours.
Mr. Nickleby, Mr. John Browdy.
"Servant, sir," said John, who was something over 6 feet high, with a face and body rather above the due proportion than below it. "Yours to command, sir," replied Nicholas, making fearful ravages on the bread and butter. Mr. Browdy was not a gentleman of great conversational powers, so he grinned twice more, and having now bestowed his customary mark of recognition on every person in company, grinned at nothing particular, and helped himself to food. The truth has to be told here. Miss Squeers was in love with Nicholas Nickleby, but her sentiments were not reciprocated. Poor Miss Squeers! Her anger, rage, and vexation, the rapid succession of bitter and passionate feelings that whirled through her mind, are not to be described. Refused.
Refused by a teacher. Picked up by advertisement at an annual salary of £5, payable at indefinite periods, and found in food and lodging like the very boys themselves.
For Nicholas, every special indignity that the malice of Miss Squeers could suggest was put upon him. Nor was this all. There was another and deeper system of annoyance, which made his heart sink, and nearly drove him wild by its injustice and cruelty. The wretched creature, Smike, since the night Nicholas had spoken kindly to him in the schoolroom, had followed him to and fro, with an ever restless desire to serve or help him, anticipating such little wants as his humble ability could supply, and content only to be near him. Upon this poor being, all the spleen and ill humour that could not be vented on Nicholas were unceasingly bestowed. "They are more hard with me than ever," sobbed the boy. "I know it," rejoined Nicholas. "They are." The boy caught both the young man's hands passionately in his, and hugging them to his breast, uttered a few broken sounds which were unintelligible. Squeers entered at the moment, and he shrunk back into his old corner. The next day, Smike was missing. His liberty was not destined to be of long duration, however, for Mr. and Mrs. Squeers set off in pursuit, and some time later, Smike, to all appearance more dead than alive, was brought in the house, and securely locked up in a cellar until such time as Mr. Squeers should deem it expedient to operate upon him in the presence of the assembled school. Expectation remained on tiptoe until afternoon, when Squeers, having refreshed himself with his dinner, and further strengthened himself by an extra libation or so, made his appearance, accompanied by his amiable partner, with a countenance of portentous import, and a fearful instrument of flagellation, strong, supple, wax-ended, and new, in short, purchased that morning expressly for the occasion. "Each boy keep his place," said Squeers, administering his favourite blow to the desk, and regarding with gloomy satisfaction the universal start which it never failed to occasion.
Nickleby, to your desk, sir.
It was remarked by more than one small observer that there was a very curious and unusual expression in the usher's face. But he took his seat without opening his lips in reply. And Squeers, casting a triumphant glance at his assistant, and a look of most comprehensive despotism on the boys, left the room, and shortly afterwards returned dragging Smike by the collar.
"Have you anything to say?"
demanded Squeers, giving his right arm 2 or 3 flourishes to try its power and suppleness.
"Stand a little out of the way, Mrs. Squeers, my dear. I've hardly got room enough."
"Spare me, sir,"
cried Smike.
"Oh, that's all, is it?"
said Squeers.
"Yes, I'll flog you within an inch of your life and spare you that."
laughed Mrs. Squeers.
"That's a good 'un."
"I was driven to it,"
said Smike faintly, and casting another imploring look about him.
"Driven to it, were you?" said Squeers. "Oh, it wasn't your fault. It was mine, I suppose, eh?"
"A nasty, ungrateful, pig-headed, brutish, obstinate, sneaking dog,"
exclaimed Mrs. Squeers, taking Smike's head under her arm and administering a cuff at every epithet.
"What does he mean by that?"
"Stand aside, my dear," replied Squeers. "We'll try and find out."
Mrs. Squeers, being out of breath with her exertions, complied. Squeers caught the boy firmly in his grip. One desperate cut had fallen on his body. He was wincing from the lash and uttering a scream of pain. It was raised again, and about to fall, when Nicholas Nickleby, suddenly starting up, cried, "Stop!" in a voice that made the rafters ring.
"Who cried stop?"
said Squeers, turning savagely round. "I," said Nicholas, stepping forward. "This must not go on." He had scarcely spoken when Squeers, in a violent outbreak of wrath and with a cry like a howl of a wild beast, spat upon him and struck him a blow across the face with his instrument of torture, which raised up a bar of livid flesh as it was inflicted. Smarting with the agony of the blow, and concentrating into that one moment all his feelings of rage, scorn, and indignation, Nicholas sprang upon him, wrested the weapon from his hand, and, pinning him by the throat, beat the ruffian till he roared for mercy. Nicholas threw all his remaining strength into 6 finishing cuts, and flung Squeers from him with all the force he could muster. The violence of his fall precipitated Mrs. Squeers completely over an adjacent form, and Squeers, striking his head against it in his descent, lay at his full length on the ground, stunned and motionless. Having brought affairs to this happy termination, and ascertained to his thorough satisfaction that Squeers was only stunned and not dead, Nicholas left his family to restore him, and retired to consider what course he had better adopt. He was something more than 250 miles from London, whither he resolved to direct his steps, with only 4 shillings and a few pence in his pocket. A lucky encounter with John Browdie resolved that difficulty, for that honest gentleman insisted that Nicholas should borrow from him whatever he required for his present necessities. "Tak that bit of timber to help thee on wi', man," he added, pressing his stick on Nicholas and giving his hand a squeeze. "Keep a good heart, and bless thee. Bitten the schoolmaster. God, it's the best thing I've heard this 20 year." And then there was Smike, who now advanced and dropped upon his knees. "Why do you kneel to me?" said Nicholas, hastily raising him. "To go with you?" "Anywhere. Everywhere. To the world's end. To the churchyard grave," replied Smike, clinging to his hand. "Let me, oh do let me. You are my home, my kind friend. Take me with you, pray." "Poor fellow," said Nicholas. Your hard fate denies you any friend but one, and he is nearly as poor and helpless as yourself. May I go with you?" asked Smike, timidly. "I will be a faithful, hard-working servant. I will, indeed." "I want no clothes," added the poor creature, drawing his rags together. "These will do very well. I only want to be near you." "And you shall," cried Nicholas. "And the world shall deal by you as it does by me, till one or both of us shall quit it for a better. Come." With these words he strapped his burden on his shoulders, and taking his stick in one hand, extended the other to his delighted charge, and so they set off together. It is time to turn again to Mrs. Nickleby and Kate, who, of sad necessity, must remain in the background of our story. Mr. Ralph Nickleby had decided that the widow and her daughter must leave Miss La Creevy's. "Yes, there's a house empty that belongs to me, which I can put you into till it is let, and then, if nothing else turns up, perhaps I shall have another. You must live there." But that was not all that he had to impart. "I've found a situation for your daughter, ma'am," said Ralph. "Well," replied Mrs. Nickleby, "now I will say that is only just what I have expected of you. Depend upon it, I said to Kate only yesterday morning at breakfast, that after your uncle has provided in that most ready manner for Nicholas, he will not leave us until he has done at least the same for you. Those were my very words, as near as I remember. Kate, my dear, why don't you thank your—" "Let me proceed, ma'am, pray," said Ralph, interrupting his sister-in-law in the full torrent of her discourse. "Kate, my love, let your uncle proceed," said Mrs. Nickleby. "I am most anxious that he should, mamma," rejoined Kate. Ralph paused for a few moments, and seeing that he had now made pretty sure of the mother, in case the daughter objected to his proposition, went on to say, "The situation that I've made interest to procure, ma'am, is with a milliner and dressmaker, in short." "A milliner?" cried Mrs. Nickleby. "The lady's name," said Ralph, hastily striking in, "is Mantalini. Madame Mantalini. I know her. She lives near Cavendish Square. If your daughter is disposed to try after the situation, I'll take her there directly." And so Kate was engaged by Madame Mantalini. It was left to the good Newman Noggs to induct Mrs. and Miss Nickleby into their new dwellings in the city, a mansion old and gloomy and black, with a wharf behind opening onto the Thames. Newman Noggs did not say that he had hunted up the old furniture they saw, from attic or cellar, or that he had taken in the halfpennyworth of milk for tea that stood upon a shelf, or filled the rusty kettle on the hob, or collected the wood chips from the wharf, or begged the coals. "We need detain you no longer, I think," said Kate. "Is there nothing I can do?" asked Newman. "Nothing, thank you," rejoined Miss Nickleby. As the jarring echoes of the heavy house door closing on its latch reverberated dismally through the building, Kate felt half tempted to call him back and beg him to remain a little while, but she was ashamed to own her fears. And Newman Noggs was on his road homewards to a bygone, faded, tumble-down street in that quarter of London in which Golden Square is situated. There lived the Kenwigses. Mr. Kenwigs was looked upon as a person of some consideration on the premises, insomuch as he occupied the whole of the first floor, comprising a suite of 2 rooms. Mrs. Kenwigs, too, was quite a lady in her manners, and of a very genteel family, having an uncle who collected a water rate. That evening Mrs. Kenwigs had invited a few select friends to cards and supper, among them Mr. Noggs, who was a genteel person to ask, because he had been a gentleman once. There came to this gathering, too, the uncle, Mr. Lillyvick, a collector of water rates, without his book, without his pen and ink, and a Miss Petowker of the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane. Miss Petowker was entreated to recite the Blood Drinker's Burial, to which end that young lady let down her back hair, and taking up her position at the other end of the room, with a bachelor friend posted in a corner, to rush out of the queue in Death Expire, and catch her in his arms when she died raving mad, went through the performance with extraordinary spirit. and to the great terror of the little Kenwigses, who were all but frightened into fits. The ecstasies consequent upon the effort had not yet subsided, and Newman, who had not been thoroughly sober at so late an hour for a long, long time, had not yet been able to put in a word of announcement that the punch was ready, when a hasty knock was heard at the room door. This rude summons was from Mr. Crowle, to tell Mr. Noggs that two queer-looking people were asking for him. Newman Noggs scrambled in violent haste upstairs to his own back garret, where, footsore and nearly shoeless, wet, dirty, jaded, and disfigured with every mark of fatiguing travel, sat Nicholas, and Smike, at once the cause and partner of his toil, both perfectly worn out by their unwonted and protracted exertion. Mr. Noggs went about making such arrangements as were in his power for the comfort of his visitors, while Nicholas pressed him with earnest questions concerning his mother and sister. It was then time for Nicholas to relate to Newman exactly what had passed at Dotheboys Hall. "The day before yesterday," said Newman, "your uncle received a letter. I took a hasty copy of it while he was out. Shall I read it?" "If you please," replied Nicholas. The letter was from Miss Fanny Squeers.
"Dotheboys Hall, Thursday morning. Sir, my pa requests me to write to you. The doctor's considering it doubtful whether he will ever recover the use of his legs which prevents his holding a pen. We are in a state of mind beyond everything, and my pa is one mask of bruises, both blue and green. You will judge from this that he has been brought very low. When your nephew that you recommended for a teacher had done this to my pa, and jumped upon his body with his feet, and also language which I will not pollute my pen with describing, he assaulted my ma with dreadful violence, dashed her to the earth, and drove her back comb several inches into her head. A very little more, and it must have entered her skull. We have a medical certificate that if it had, the tortoiseshell would have affected the brain. Me and my brother were then the victims of his fury, since which we have suffered very much, which leads us to the harrowing belief that we have received some injury in our insides, especially as no marks of violence are visible externally. I am screaming out loud all the time I write, and so is my brother, which takes off my attention rather, and I hope will excuse mistakes. The monster, having satiated his thirst for blood, ran away, taking with him a boy of desperate character that he had excited to rebellion. My pa begs that if he comes to you, that you will let the assassin go, as if we prosecute him he will only be transported, and if he is let go he is sure to be hung before long, which will save us the trouble and be more satisfactory. Hoping to hear from you when convenient, I remain yours and etc., Fanny Squeers. P.S. I pity his ignorance and despise him."
The first care of Nicholas now was to employ himself in a new capacity, and from the General Agency Office his steps were led to Manchester Buildings, Westminster, where Mr. Gregsbury, the great Member of Parliament, wanted a young man to keep his papers and correspondence in order. Nicholas, it seemed, was exactly the sort of man that Mr. Gregsbury wanted. But when the talk came round to the duties of a secretary, and the salary proposed by Mr. Gregsbury, then what had seemed a bright prospect suddenly grew dim. 15 shillings a week is not much, said Nicholas, mildly. Not much. 15 shillings a week not much, young man, cried Mr. Gregsbury. 15 shillings a... Pray do not suppose that I quarrel with the sum, replied Nicholas, for I am not ashamed to confess that whatever it may be in itself, to me it is a great deal. But the duties and responsibilities make the recompense small, and they are so very heavy that I fear to undertake them. Do you decline to undertake them, sir? Inquired Mr. Gregsbury, with his hand on the bell-rope. I fear they are too great for my powers, however good my will may be, replied Nicholas. That is as much as to say that you rather not accept the place, and that you consider 15 shillings a week too little, said Mr. Gregsbury, ringing. Do you decline it, sir? I have no alternative but to do so, replied Nicholas. Door, Matthews, said Mr. Gregsbury as the boy appeared. "I'm sorry to have troubled you unnecessarily, sir," said Nicholas. "I'm sorry you have," rejoined Mr. Gregsbury, turning his back upon him. "Door, Matthews." "Good morning," said Nicholas. "Door, Matthews," cried Mr. Gregsbury. Unsuccessful at this first attempt, Nicholas was thus obliged to accept an engagement as a tutor in French to the 4 Miss Kenwigses, Newman Noggs having explained that Nicholas was a tutor of great accomplishments, involved in some misfortunes which he was not at liberty to explain, and bearing the name of Johnson. He was received by Mrs. Kenwigs with a genteel air, and there he found too Miss Petowker and Mr. Lillyvick.
Mr. Johnson is engaged as a private master to the children, uncle," said Mrs. Kenwigs.
"So you said just now, my dear,"
replied Mr. Lillyvick, and the collector turned to Nicholas.
What's the water in French, sir?"
"L'eau," replied Nicholas.
"Oh,"
said Mr. Lillyvick, shaking his head mournfully.
"I thought as much. Low, eh? I don't think anything of that language. Nothing at all."
"I suppose the children may begin, uncle,"
said Mrs. Kenwigs.
"Oh, yes, they may begin, my dear," replied the collector, discontentedly. "I've no wish to prevent them."
Return we now to the fortunes of Miss Kate Nickleby, at the establishment of Madame Mantalini. The life to which poor Kate Nickleby was devoted, in consequence of the unforeseen train of circumstances already developed in this narrative, was a hard one. But lest the very dullness, unhealthy confinement, and bodily fatigue which made up its sum and substance should deprive it of any interest with the mass of the charitable and sympathetic, I would rather keep Miss Nickleby herself in view just now, than chill them in the outset by a minute and lengthened description of the establishment presided over by Madame Mantalini. "Well, no, indeed, Madame Mantalini," said Miss Nagg, as Kate was taking her weary way homewards on the first night of her novitiate. "That Miss Nickleby is a very creditable young person. A very creditable young person, indeed. Upon my word." Miss Nagg, who displayed much sweetness in the beginning, and doted on Kate for 3 whole days, thereafter made up her mind, for reasons which need not trouble us here, to hate her for evermore. "I hate her," cried Miss Nagg. "I detest and hate her. Never let her speak to me again. Never let anybody who is a friend of mine speak to her. A slut, a hussy, an impudent, artful hussy." Having denounced the object of her wrath in these terms, Miss Nagg screamed once, hiccuped twice, and gurgled in her throat several times, slumbered, shivered, woke, came to, composed her headdress, and declared herself quite well again. Poor Kate had regarded these proceedings at first in perfect bewilderment. She had then turned red and pale by turns, and once or twice essayed to speak. But although she walked proudly to her seat, and turned her back upon the group of little satellites who clustered round their ruling planet in the remotest corner of the room, Kate gave way in secret to some such bitter tears as would have gladdened Miss Nagg's inmost soul if she could have seen them fall. There was a dinner at Mr. Ralph Nickleby's, at which the pleasure of Miss Nickleby's company was requested. There, Kate was subjected to the objectionable attentions of Sir Mulberry Hawk, best described as a fashionable vagabond. "I wish you to understand, sir," said Kate, trembling in spite of herself, but speaking with great indignation, "that your behaviour offends and disgusts me. If you have one spark of gentlemanly feeling remaining, you will leave me instantly."
"Now why?" said Sir Mulberry. "Why will you keep up this appearance of excessive vigour, my sweet creature? Now be more natural. My dear Miss Nickleby, be more natural. Do."
Kate hastily rose, but as she rose, Sir Mulberry caught her dress and forcibly detained her. "Let me go, sir," she cried, her heart swelling with anger. "Do you hear? Instantly, this moment."
Sit down, said Sir Mulberry. "I want to talk to you."
"Unhand me, sir, this instant," cried Kate.
"Not for the world," rejoined Sir Mulberry.
Thus speaking, he leant over, as if to replace her in her chair, but the young lady making a violent effort to disengage herself, he lost his balance and measured his length upon the ground. As Kate sprung forward to leave the room, Mr. Ralph Nickleby appeared in the doorway and confronted her. "What is this?" said Ralph. "It is this, sir," replied Kate, violently agitated, "that beneath the roof where I, a helpless girl, your dead brother's child, should most have found protection, I have been exposed to insult which should make you shrink to look upon me. Let me pass you." Little Miss La Creevy trotted briskly through divers streets at the west end of the town early on Monday morning, the day after the dinner, charged with the most important commission of acquainting Madame Mantalini that Miss Nickleby was too unwell to attend that day, but hoped to be enabled to resume her duties on the morrow. "So far as I am concerned," said Miss Nagg, when the message had been delivered with many ornaments of speech, "I could spare Miss Nickleby for evermore." And all too soon, Kate found herself without a situation. "And I say again," remarked Mrs. Nickleby, who, it is scarcely necessary to observe, had never said so before, "I say again that a milliner's and a dressmaker's is the very last description of business, Kate, that you should have thought of attaching yourself to. I don't make it a reproach to you, my love, but still I will say that if you had consulted your own mother—" "Well, mamma," said Kate mildly, "what would you recommend now?" "Recommend?" cried Mrs. Nickleby. "Isn't it obvious, my dear, that of all the occupations in this world for a young lady situated as you are, that of companion to some amiable lady is the very thing for which your education and manners and personal appearance and everything else exactly qualify you?" The truth then came out. Mrs. Nickleby had observed in the newspaper an advertisement, couched in the purest and most grammatical English, announcing that a Mrs. Wottitley of Cadogan Place was in want of a genteel young person as companion. And so to Cadogan Place. "What are your accomplishments?" asked Mrs. Wottitley, with her eyes shut. Kate blushed as she mentioned her principal acquirements, and Mrs. Nickleby checked them all off one by one on her fingers, having calculated the number before she came out. Luckily the two calculations agreed, so Mrs. Nickleby had no excuse for talking. "You are a good temper?" asked Mrs. Wottitley, opening her eyes for an instant and shutting them again. "I hope so," rejoined Kate. "And have a highly respectable reverence for everything, have you?" Kate replied that she had, and laid her uncle's card upon the table. The inquiries were made. The answer, not to Kate's very great joy, was favourable, and at the expiration of a week she betook herself, with all her movables and valuables, to Mrs. Wottitley's mansion, where for the present we will leave her. Meanwhile, Nicholas, accused by Fanny Squeers of violent, even criminal behaviour to her father, was renounced by his uncle Ralph, and compelled to take leave of his mother and sister. But from poor Smike he would not be parted. "The word which separates us," said Nicholas, grasping him heartily by the shoulder, "that word shall never be said by me, for you are my only comfort and stay. I would not lose you now for all the world could give. The thought of you has upheld me through all I have endured today, and shall through 50 times such trouble. Give me your hand. My heart is linked to yours. We will journey from this place together before the week is out. What if I am steeped in poverty? You lighten it, and we will be poor together." It was a cold, dry, foggy morning in early spring. They had tied up the luggage, Smike shouldered it, and away they went with Newman Noggs in company, for he had insisted on walking as far as he could with them overnight. "Which way?" asked Newman, wistfully. "To Kingston first," replied Nicholas. "And where afterwards?" asked Newman. "Why won't you tell me?" "Because I scarcely know myself, good friend," rejoined Nicholas. "I am afraid you have some deep scheme in your head," said Newman, doubtfully. "So deep," replied his young friend, "that even I can't fathom it. Whatever I resolve upon, depend upon it, I will write you soon." "You won't forget?" said Newman. "I am not very likely to," rejoined Nicholas. "I have not so many friends that I should grow confused among the number and forget my best one." And so Newman made affectionate farewell. "Now listen to me, Smike," said Nicholas, as they trudged with stout hearts onwards. "We are bound for Portsmouth." Smike nodded his head and smiled, but expressed no other emotion. For whether they had been bound for Portsmouth or Port Royal would have been alike to him, so they had been bound together. As they walked on, Nicholas put a question. "What of the day you first went to Yorkshire, before you began to lose your recollection? Was the weather hot or cold?" "Wet," replied the boy. "Very wet. I've always said that when it rained hard, that it was like the night I came. And they used to crowd round and laugh to see me cry when the rain fell heavily. It was like a child, they said, and that made me think of it more. I turned cold all over sometimes, for I could see myself as I was then, coming in at the very same door." "As you were then?" repeated Nicholas, with assumed carelessness. "How was that?" "Such a little creature," said Smike, "that they might have had pity and mercy upon me, only to remember it." "You didn't find your way there alone," remarked Nicholas. "No," rejoined Smike. "Oh, no." "Who was with you?" "A man. A dark, withered man. I've heard them say so at the school, and I remembered that before. I was glad to leave him. I was afraid of him. But they made me more afraid of them, and used me harder, too." Smike was tiring, and a glance at his toil-worn face determined Nicholas to stay where they now found themselves, at a roadside inn yet 12 miles short of Portsmouth. Nicholas made inquiries about supper, and the landlord assured him that it would be most convenient for them to eat with a gentleman in the parlour that had ordered hot beef-steak pudding and potatoes at 9. And Nicholas and Smike were ushered into the parlour, there to meet the gentleman, Mr. Crummles. Nicholas was prepared for something odd, but not for something quite so odd as the sight he encountered. At the upper end of the room were a couple of boys, one of them very tall, and the other very short, both dressed as sailors, or at least as theatrical sailors, with belts, buckles, pigtails, and pistols complete, fighting what is called in playbills a terrific combat, with 2 of those short broadswords with basket hilts which are commonly used at our minor theatres. The short boy had gained a great advantage over the tall boy, who was reduced to mortal strait, and both were overlooked by a large, heavy man, perched against the corner of a table, who emphatically adjured them to strike a little more fire out of the swords, and they couldn't fail to bring the house down on the very first night. "Mr. Vincent Crummles," said the landlord with an air of great deference, "this is the young gentleman." Mr. Vincent Crummles received Nicholas with an inclination of the head, something between the courtesy of a Roman emperor and the nod of a pot companion, and bade the landlord shut the door and be gone. "There's a picture," said Mr. Crummles, motioning Nicholas not to advance and spoil it. "The little un has him. If the big un doesn't knock under in 3 seconds, he's a dead man. Do that again, boys." The 2 combatants went to work afresh, and chopped away until the swords emitted a shower of sparks, to the great satisfaction of Mr. Crummles, who appeared to consider this as a very great point indeed. "That'll be a double encore if you take care, boys," said Mr. Crummles. "You'd better get your wind now and change your clothes." Having addressed these words to the combatants, he saluted Nicholas, who then observed that the face of Mr. Crummles was quite proportionate in size to his body, and that he had a very full underlip, a hoarse voice, as though he were in the habit of shouting very much, and very short black hair, shaved off nearly to the crown of the head, to admit, as he afterwards learned, of his more easily wearing character wigs of any shape or pattern. "What did you think of that, sir?" inquired Mr. Crummles. "Oh, very good, indeed." "Capital," answered Nicholas. "You won't see such boys as those often, I think," said Mr. Crummles.
I opened Portsmouth the day after tomorrow. If you're going there, look into the theatre.
Nicholas promised to do so if he could, and drawing a chair near the fire, fell into conversation with the manager at once. He was very talkative and communicative, stimulated perhaps not only by his natural disposition, but by the spirits and water he sipped very plentifully, or the snuff, which he took in large quantities, from a piece of whitey brown paper in his waistcoat pocket. Nicholas quite wondered where it all went to. While he was thus engaged, Mr. Crummles looked from time to time with great interest at Smike, with whom he had appeared considerably struck from the first. Smike had now fallen asleep, and was nodding in his chair.
"'Excuse my saying so,"
said the manager, leaning over to Nicholas and sinking his voice.
"But, what a capital countenance your friend has got."
"Poor fellow," said Nicholas with a half-smile. "I wish it were a little more plump and less haggard."
"Plump?"
exclaimed the manager, quite horrified.
"You'd spoil it forever."
"Do you think so?"
"Think so, sir? Why, as he is now," said the manager, striking his knee emphatically, "without a pad on his body, and hardly a touch of paint on his face, he'd make such an actor for the starved business as was never seen in this country.
Only let him be tolerably well up in the apothecary in Romeo and Juliet, with the slightest possible dab of red on the tip of his nose, and he'd be certain of 3 rounds the moment he put his head out of the practicable door in the front grooves O.P. Then Mr. Crummles turned his attention to Nicholas, with an inquiry as to the purpose of his journey.
"What's to be got to do at Portsmouth more than anywhere else?"
asked Mr. Vincent Crummles, melting the sealing wax on the stem of his pipe in the candle, and rolling it out afresh with his little finger. "There are many vessels leaving the port, I suppose," replied Nicholas. "I shall try for a berth on some ship or other. There is meat and drink there, at all events." The countenance of Nicholas fell, and he gazed ruefully at the fire.
"Does no other profession occur to you, which a young man of your figure and address could take up easily, and see the world to advantage in?"
asked the manager. "No," said Nicholas, shaking his head.
"Why then, I'll tell you one,"
said Mr. Crummles, throwing his pipe in the fire and raising his voice.
"The stage."
"The stage?" cried Nicholas.
"The theatrical profession," said Mr. Vincent Crummles. "I am in the theatrical profession myself. My wife is in the theatrical profession. My children are in the theatrical profession. I had a dog that lived and died in it from a puppy, and my chaise pony goes on in Time or the Tartar. I'll bring you out, and your friend too. Say the word. I want a novelty."
Nicholas thought of the small amount of small change that would remain in his pocket after paying the tavern bill, and he hesitated.
"You can be useful to us in 100 ways," said Mr. Crummles. "Think what capital bills a man of your education could write for the shop windows."
"Well, I think I could manage that department," said Nicholas.
"To be sure you could," replied Mr. Crummles. "For further particulars, see small handbills. We might have half a volume in every one of them. Pieces, too. Why, you could write us a piece to bring out the whole strength of the company whenever we wanted one."
"What should I get for all this?" inquired Nicholas, after a few moments' reflection. "Could I live by it?"
"Live by it," said the manager, "like a prince. With your own salary, and your friends, and your write-ins, you'd make £1 a week."
"You don't say so?"
"I do indeed. And if we had a run of good houses, nearly double the money."
Nicholas shrugged his shoulders, but sheer destitution was before him. Without more deliberation, he hastily declared that it was a bargain, and gave Mr. Vincent Crummles his hand on it. Next morning, Nicholas and Mr. Crummles proceeded on their journey by means of a strange 4-legged animal which Mr. Crummles called a pony, and a vehicle of unknown design, on which he bestowed the appellation of a 4-wheeled phaeton. The Master Crummleses and Smike were packed together behind with a wicker basket containing the properties. Once arrived at the theatre, Nicholas was introduced to a stout, portly female, apparently between 40 and 50, with a great quantity of hair.
Mr. Johnson,
said the manager, for Nicholas had given the name which Newman Noggs had bestowed upon him in his conversation with Mrs. Kenwigs.
let me introduce Mrs. Vincent Crummles. I am glad to see you, sir,
said Mrs. Vincent Crummles, in a sepulchral voice.
I'm very glad to see you, and still more happy to hail you as a promising member of our corps.
The lady shook Nicholas by the hand as she addressed him in these terms. He saw that it was a large one, but had not expected quite such an iron grip as that with which she honoured him.
And this,
said the lady, crossing to Smike, as tragic actresses cross when they obey a stage direction.
And this is the other. You two are welcome, sir. He'll do, I think, my dear,
said the manager, taking a pinch of snuff.
He is admirable, replied the lady. An acquisition, indeed.
As the company began to muster, Nicholas was privileged to see the infant phenomenon, a distinctly elderly 10-year-old daughter of Mr. Crummles, and to meet the actors, Mr. Fillaire, with a repertoire of faces from his pantomime collection, Mr. Lenville,
who does our first tragedy,
Tommy Fillaire explained.
Except when old Bricks and Mortar takes it in his head to do it himself, you should add, Tommy,
remarked Mr. Lenville.
You know who Bricks and Mortar is, I suppose?
I do not, indeed, replied Nicholas.
We call Crummles that, because his style of acting is rather in a heavy and ponderous way,
said Mr. Lenville. And then there was Miss Sneverleachy, who could do anything from a medley dance to Lady Macbeth, Miss Belvorney, who seldom aspired to speaking parts, the beautiful Miss Bravassa, Mrs. Lenville in a very limp bonnet, Miss Gazingi in an imitation ermine boa, and Mrs. Grudden in a beaver bonnet. Mr. Crummles publicly heralded Nicholas as a
prodigy of genius and learning. Ladies and gentlemen,
said Mr. Vincent Crummles, who had been writing on a piece of paper,
we'll call the mortal struggle tomorrow at 10. Everybody for the procession. Intrigues and ways and means. You're all up in it, so we shall only want one rehearsal. Everybody at 10, if you please.
Everybody at 10,
repeated Mrs. Grudden, looking about her.
On Monday morning we shall read a new piece, said Mr. Crummles. The name's not known yet, but everybody will have a good part. Mr. Johnson will take care of that.
Hullo, said Nicholas, starting.
On Monday morning,
repeated Mr. Crummles, raising his voice to drown the unfortunate Mr. Johnson's remonstrance.
That'll do, ladies and gentlemen.
The ladies and gentlemen required no second notice to quit, and in a few minutes the theatre was deserted, save by the Crummles family, Nicholas, and Smike. "Upon my word," said Nicholas, taking the manager aside, "I don't think I can be ready by Monday. My invention is not accustomed to these demands, or possibly I might—"
"Invention? What the devil's that got to do with it?" cried the manager hastily.
"Everything, my dear sir."
"Nothing, my dear sir,"
retorted the manager, with evident impatience.
"Do you understand French?"
"Perfectly well."
"Very good,"
said the manager, opening the table drawer and giving a roll of paper from it to Nicholas.
"There. Just turn that into English. Put your name on the title page."
Nicholas smiled and pocketed the play.
"What are you going to do about your lodgings?"
said Mr. Crummles. Nicholas could not help thinking that for the first week it would be an uncommon convenience to have a turn-up bedstead in the pit, but he merely remarked that he had not turned his thoughts that way.
"Come home with me, then," said Mr. Crummles, "and my boy shall go with you after dinner and show you the most likely place."
The offer was not to be refused. Nicholas and Mr. Crummles gave Mrs. Crummles an arm each, and walked up the street in stately array. Smike, the boys, and the phenomenon went home by a shorter cut, and Mrs. Grudden remained behind to take some cold Irish stew and a pint of porter in the box office.
"Let me see,"
said the manager, cogitating after dinner.
"Would you like some nice little part with the infant phenomenon?"
"You are very good," replied Nicholas hastily, "but I think perhaps it would be better if I had someone of my own size at first. In case I should turn out awkward, I should feel more at home, perhaps."
"True,"
said the manager.
"Perhaps you would, and you could play up to the infant in time, you know."
"Certainly," replied Nicholas, devoutly hoping that it would be a very long time before he was honoured with this distinction.
"Then I'll tell you what we'll do," said Mr. Crummles. "You shall study Romeo when you've done that piece. Juliet, Miss Snevellicci, old Grudden, the nurse. Yes, that'll do very well. Rover, too. You might get up Rover while you're about it, and Cassio, and Jeremy Diddler. You can easily knock 'em off. One part helps the other so much. Here they are, cues and all."
With these hasty general directions, Mr. Crummles thrust a number of little books into the faltering hands of Nicholas, and bidding his eldest son go with him and show him where lodgings were to be had, shook him by the hand and wished him good night. There was to be a benefit night for Miss Snevellicci. Nicholas worked away at the piece, which was speedily put into rehearsal, and then worked away at its own part, which he studied with great perseverance, and acted, as the whole company said, to perfection. And at length the great day arrived. A crier was sent round in the morning to proclaim the entertainments with sound of bell in all the thoroughfares. At 5:30 there was a rush of 4 people to the gallery door. At 6:15 there were at least a dozen. At 6 o'clock the kicks were terrific, and when the elder Master Crummles opened the door, he was obliged to run behind it for his life. 15 shillings were taken by Mrs. Grudden in the first 10 minutes. At last the orchestra left off, and the curtain rose upon the new piece. The first scene, in which there was nobody particular, passed off calmly enough. But when Miss Snevellicci went on in the second, accompanied by the phenomenon as child, what a roar of applause broke out. Then, when Nicholas came on for his crack scene with Mrs. Crummles, what a clapping of hands there was. When Mrs. Crummles, who was his unworthy mother, sneered and called him presumptuous boy, and he defied her, what a tumult of applause came on. When he quarrelled with the other gentleman about the young lady, and produced a case of pistols, said that if he was a gentleman, he would fight him in that drawing-room, till the furniture was sprinkled with the blood of one, if not of 2. How boxes, pit, and gallery joined in one most vigorous cheer. In short, the success of both new piece and new actor was complete, and when Miss Snevellicci was called for at the end of the play, Nicholas led her on and divided the applause.